Welcome to the Indigo Podcast, an exploration of human flourishing at work and beyond. I'm Ben Barron of Indigo Anchor and Cleveland State University.
And I'm Chris Everett of Indigo Anchor. For more information, please visit us at www.indigopodcast.com.
So our topic today is difficult conversations. And today we're drawing from this great book by Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton, and Sheila Heen. And the title of that book is Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most. And this is a book that we have found, both Chris and I have found very useful for our own development as leaders, as well as for using with our clients and with other executives to really help them to have these conversations that you have to have as a leader. And, you know, the stuff we're going to talk about today not only applies to the workplace, of course, because communication, relationships, difficult conversations, these are just a ubiquitous type of activity throughout all of life, you know? And so we're going to be drawing heavily from that book. I encourage you all to go buy it. And also, if you are Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton, or Sheila Heen, the authors of the book, let us know. We'd love to have you on.
Yeah, that's right, Ben. So I guess a summary of what we're going to talk about today is like, what is a difficult conversation and when should you have them, right?
Yep.
There's 3 conversations. We'll talk about what they are and how to prepare for and conduct those difficult conversations. So this episode is super important to us. Ben, why do you find it so important?
Well, you know, it's one of those things that is just a part of life. You know, in order to flourish in this world, kind of like we talk about in our manifesto, you know, a lot of this comes down to interpersonal relationships. And when people are afraid to have the difficult conversations that need to occur, oftentimes that can lead to just suboptimal existence. And, you know, I just think that having these difficult conversations and at least having the tools that you can use to have them is just such an important part of our lives.
Right. And I think this touches on pretty much every aspect of human relationships in the sense of we run into these problems all the time, and how we react to them kind of shapes how our life moves forward. So, you know, I think everybody can relate to the sentiment of, ugh, that didn't go how I wanted it to go.
Yeah.
You know, and we can't read each other's minds, but we do have a theory of the mind where we can kind of guess and extrapolate based on our experiences with others in the past, which if you come from, say, a broken home or a not so great background, you may not be able to read situations so well. If you're on the autism spectrum, you may have a hard time reading those things. But even without any of those complicating factors, we just can't read each other's minds. So through life, as we grow up, we have these interactions with people, and lots of times they derail and just don't go so well.
That's right.
And that's what. So I guess let's just launch into it. What is a difficult conversation, Ben?
Yeah, so difficult conversations refer to any of those situations where you have, you know, two sides or multiple parties that have different needs and wants, and these are those conversations that generate some very strong emotions. You know, these are the ones where when you start having them, you may start to feel really what we call emotionally flooded, and, you know, it can be really tough. It's usually when there's a lot at stake, either in terms of the actual outcome of the conversation or in terms of the relationship that you're trying to have with that person or trying to repair with that person. And, you know, you fear the outcome. And these are conversations that, you know, I just see, and I can come up with examples from my own life. I can think of examples from people I've worked with and so forth, that a lot of people just avoid them.
Well, yeah. They're painful and yucky.
Yeah. Well, one thing that they talk about in the book is, you know, whenever you have a difficult conversation, it is, you know, something akin to throwing a grenade into the mix, you know?
Right. And so one of the things that Ben, shapes both of our lives is this idea of evidence-based decision making and evidence-based, approach to things. And so you got to just go out and buy this daggone book, Difficult Conversations, because it's Harvard has this group that focuses on negotiation and conflict and that kind of stuff. It's an awesome group. They release a lot of good stuff. This is one of the items from that. But this will give you the process, kind of like opening up the hood and seeing what the bits and pieces and things that go on in a difficult conversation so you can know what the roadmap looks like. So, but I want to put this caveat out there. Once you know all this stuff, it'll be super helpful. But it doesn't mean that you're just going to feel hunky-dory and, some kind of Vulcan, passivity and not be, emotionally reactive in these situations. We're humans. We have real feelings going into this stuff. But just like maybe a whitewater river that you've been on before, it's going to have some rapids, but you kind of know what the outlay of the river looks like and that there's an end in sight. This book will help you with that tools. And so that can help you calm yourself as you go through these process.
Right. And you also need to assume, oftentimes, when you're having these difficult conversations that we'll talk about here in the episode, that the other person with whom you're having the conversation, they aren't necessarily going to have read this book. I've used this book actually in. I have I teach a leadership class for MBA students, and I use this book as one of the many books that I made them read last semester. And sometimes many of the students, they said, this is great. I love this book. How do I get this other person to understand this stuff? And that's part of the trick is you've got to be able to work with people who are not on the same maybe knowledge or skill level, and that's part of the whole game here. And I like your metaphor of this is kind of knowing what the river is going to look like when you have these difficult conversations. So why don't we give a couple examples from of difficult conversations?
Oh man, so you got an employee and they're stinking, right? For whatever reasons.
Yeah, either literally or figuratively.
Oh, yeah. Personal hygiene issue in the workplace, yeah, that can be a challenge, right? But anyway, lots of times you have to have a conversation with this person. And, we know the evidence says sooner's better than later. But for some reason you delay, and then you delay again. And the more you delay, it builds up more emotional intensity that even shouldn't be there. But, that could be a difficult conversation like, hey, Bill, your work product is just not up to snuff, What's one for you, Ben?
Yeah, so this could be when either someone at work or in your personal life is taking advantage of you and, you feel taken for granted. You're doing a lot of things that you think are beneficial to the relationship. The other person, in your view, is not pulling his or her own weight. And that, over time, can really fester and create some real negativity and be damaging in the long run, right? Because those emotions are going to leak into the conversation at some point. It could also go to the extreme. I've never really been in this situation, but it could include, mistreatment, abuse, those types of situations as well. And, we see this both in the workplace in terms of bullying and other types of just nastiness. And we also see this, of course, in domestic situations.
Right. You think of what was that movie with the DiCaprio with the certain investment bank cultures, right?
Yeah.
Or sometimes I'll see this in sales organization where there's this total bro culture and hazing. I mean, you see the hazing and stuff. Some of us
ridiculous.
Yeah, I know. You grow up around that, and anyway, so talking about that, hey, you write my paycheck, but would you stop abusing me? I mean, there's a structural power thing. Those can be really challenging conversations because what if you don't have cash to float around 3 or 4 months looking for a job?
Right. And when there's that power differential and you've got to, it's not a poor performing direct report, but it's your boss who's creating these issues. That's a difficult conversation.
Yeah. Hey, man, this culture's toxic and it's kind of your fault.
Right, right.
I know we laugh, but it's only because we just see that all the time. And it's a stress relief laugh. It's just really bad, the stuff you see out there.
Yeah. It also could be when someone violates a policy. It could be delivering bad news to someone. Those can oftentimes be difficult conversations. Making requests, getting somebody to try to do something, especially if it's kind of a sizable type of request. Those can definitely be difficult as well.
Right. So, difficult conversations, you got to have them, but sometimes you shouldn't. Right.
That's true. That's true.
It's not worth it. So Ben, when should you not make a difficult conversation happen?
So there are a couple different times when it probably doesn't make sense to try to talk it out. Sometimes I feel like the bias is towards, hey, we just got to get everybody in there and really, talk this thing out. That doesn't always actually do anything, and sometimes it can actually be damaging. But a couple specific times in which it's not a good idea to try to go down this road of having the difficult conversation is, number one, when you really take an honest look at the situation and you realize the problem is you. Yeah, right. You realize that, I created this problem. I contributed a lot here, and I need to change my behavior. That's definitely a time when the conversation probably isn't going to do a whole lot.
No, and it's kind of a sign of a healthy psyche if you're reflecting on yourself first, right?
Right. But it's not a natural thing, I think, for a lot of people. This is a really tough thing to do.
Yeah, and I don't know if it is tough or not. I just know that you got to take a look at yourself. If you want to have psychological health, you have to take a look. That doesn't mean victim blame. Like if you've been legitimately harassed or abused or wronged or whatever, you still have to take a look at yourself first. But that doesn't mean that you have to, and we'll get to that later in the episode, accept blame or any of that kind of stuff.
Right.
But you do need to make sure, because if you're going to look like a freaking moron if you go into the conversation and the problem is you. You don't really have a leg to stand on. So we just want to throw that option out. And because difficult conversations are challenging, there are better options from having those conversations, like changing your approach. You could go through this big conversation that requires probably somebody to adjust the behavior they've had their whole life. Or if if I just shoot this in an email request, he responds better than a paper request or something like that.
Right. So when number one, it doesn't make sense to have a difficult conversation when you realize that the problem truly is you. Number two, when there's an option that's better than talking, and like you said, changing your behavior, your approach. And also just, you need to do some honest self-reflection and really ensure that your purpose for having the conversation makes sense. This can't be a situation where you're just going in to try to prove yourself right.
Although that's fun.
Right. This is the people who say, I'm just brutally honest. And it's like, okay, well, how's that working for you?
Yeah. Being brutal is, I guess it works for Conan the Barbarian, but I wouldn't recommend it for some other stuff, right? Or now that you've been listening to the podcast for a while, maybe subscribe to some industrial and organizational psychology journals. You don't, say like, well, here's 40 peer-reviewed papers saying what a crappy boss you are. Right? Like that's
Exhibit A, B, C, and D on how crappy you are. Probably not the best approach.
And it may bring catharsis, but that would not be a purpose that makes sense, right?
Correct.
And that's being a jerk too, so don't do it.
That's right. So I think that kind of helps explain a little bit about what a difficult conversation is. I think our listeners can probably think of many different situations that they've been in or have found themselves around that constitute a difficult conversation. But one really key aspect of difficult conversations that is described in this book is this idea of the the three conversations that are really going on in any one conversation. So,
Right.
What's that all about?
Well, yeah. So generally, and this just comes from not knowing the data, I think, or knowing what's going on under the hood here, is you think you're having a conversation about something. Generally, I think most people go to the what happened conversation, but you're actually having three levels of dialogue at one time, which I think is what makes it hard to unpack the hard conversations. And so the three conversations just at a high level are what happened, the what happened conversation, the feelings conversation, and the identity conversation. So well, let's just go through those. So the what happened conversation is, well, what went on, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And it turns into, kind of a, it's almost like a trial. You're interrogating each other and coming up with your version of facts and so forth. And, this is where a lot of conversations start. And if you're not careful, it can really start to derail things. But there are some things that you should do, when you're having that conversation, when you're talking about what happened, that can make it a little bit better.
Right. And this is a conversation that you're not going to have a difficult conversation without bringing up actual stuff that occurred, right?
Right.
So some best practices and kind of how to conduct the what happened conversation is you got to take a learning stance, right? You may think you know exactly what happened, but you need to explore the other person's story, how they saw it. You'd look like a complete numbskull if you said, oh, well, you didn't know this key fact. And you're like, oh, shoot,
Right.
You got to explore that other person. And it changes the tone of the conversation when you begin exploring. So if you come into a conversation like, look, man, this is what happened. Like, that's way different than, hey, so this was challenging. Could you help me understand what was going on from your perspective?
Right. And what I loved about how you just phrased that is it's not accusatory. It's kind of talking about, this is a challenge. This was a challenging thing that happened. It's not blaming the other person, and it's giving the other person the opportunity to share their story first instead of just, spewing all the things that are on your mind.
Ugh. Yeah. So
which doesn't usually work very well.
I can't tell you how many, and I had one this past week where somebody was like, hey, here's what's going on. And it just wasn't the case. But yeah, we couldn't really get anywhere because it was just, and that's an example we were talking earlier. Sometimes the other person doesn't know this stuff. So what you can do in those situations is maybe offer, it's like, hey, could we take a moment and maybe explore my view of the situation?
Right.
You can use these terms to help guide the other side through this. So another piece of the what happened conversation is how to conduct it is, don't assume they meant it. So this is where we talk about disentangling intent from impact. Now, this may completely hose your world, what went down, right? But we're not mind readers. And this is a big part of psychology or therapy that, psychologists will deal with patients is this idea of cognitive distortions. That's where our brains are sense-making tools. Some psychologists will send me an email and say, this was wrong. But at a high level, this is, and we cannot read minds. But our minds are trying to make sense of the world around us. So we have to make a lot of guesses. And lots of times our guesses are quite good. So good that we can miss sometimes. And we don't want to miss during these difficult conversations. So just because an action or something that happened really hosed your world doesn't mean that other person intended to do it maliciously.
Right. And even if you have some evidence to suggest that they really did mean it, it doesn't help the conversation to go in guns blazing, assuming that, right?
Right.
So I think it's very important to separate those two things, as you mentioned. And another thing you need to do when you're having this what happened conversation is stop blaming. Really, abandon blame. in this situation, because at its heart, blame is about judging the other person and trying to figure out how they mess things up. And the alternative to that is thinking about what the authors call a contribution system, and understanding that any root causes that lead to a difficult conversation oftentimes have multiple causal mechanisms, right? Everybody involved probably had some level of contribution to what happened. And this is about trying to understand the situation better instead of judging and blaming.
Right. When you focus on blame, it sets the wrong emotional tone. You got to look at contributions and everything. There is, everybody contributes something. Sometimes your only contribution is I showed up to work that day.
Right.
Right. Like maybe it is totally, but you got to talk about those. But there's some misconceptions with contributions, right? And one of them is you should only focus on my contribution. And this is like a type of self-flagellation, right? Where, oh no, you don't want to be the, suffering soul that, what did I do? And there is, I don't know if there's some kind of mental catharsis or, there's some, pop psych articles on the web that talks about, just, look at yourself, and that stuff's garbage, right? Yeah. Be kind to yourself. The other person likely contributed negatively, right? Don't just focus on you. That would be a total misconception, because you'll not be able to see accurately if you're only looking at one side, even if that's your own side.
Right. And, another misconception that goes along with that is, if I put aside blame, it means I don't have to, it means I'm also putting aside my feelings about it. That's not true either, right? You can have very strong feelings about things, and there are ways to share those even in a difficult conversation. This is not just about saying, oh, well, I'm just going to, let this person walk all over me. That's not at all what a difficult conversation is about. It's about trying to reach a solution, trying to map this contribution system in a way that allows for a better picture of the relationship and how to move forward to really emerge.
Yeah, and your own psyche won't accept that. It's, people, you'll see this kind of stuff when, hey, why are you so nervous, Ben? Oh, well, I've got a job interview in an hour and I'm terrified. Oh, well, don't be nervous. Oh, magically, I'm not nervous now. It doesn't work. Our brains, oh man, it'd be so great if they worked that way, but they just don't work that way. Right. And so when you're going to this conversation, if you try to put aside your feelings, it's not going to be successful, and it's going to color the entire conversation. So don't do it. And then the last misconception, or one of the other main ones, is exploring contributions means blaming the victim. Don't do it.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So just because you're exploring what each person did in the situation, doesn't mean that the person who was wronged in the situation is being blamed, right? This is about figuring out, how different actions by the different parties all came together to create whatever mess you're in.
Right. So I think that's pretty good. So the what happened conversation has to happen. You have to discuss, but you want to explore each other's stories. Don't assume intent. Don't let your brain is flooded with emotions and stuff. Don't let it make you jump to conclusions, and just take a learning stance through that.
That's right.
So the next conversation, Ben, is the feelings conversation, and this is generally the guts of the difficult conversation.
And this is the conversation that's happening kind of between the lines of the what happened conversation. Oftentimes we're saying this is about a specific thing that happened, but it's really about, the feelings that are associated with it. And, this is really important to recognize.
Yeah. And feelings are why it's even a difficult conversation. If you were an android or something, you wouldn't have difficulties with any conversations, but we fear the outcome. Fear is a strong emotion, right?
Very strong.
Yeah, and so those are the things that's why they're difficult conversations to begin with. So often we say the problem's about what happened, right? Or something specific, but it's really about the feelings that are going into that. Like, when you talked over me in the meeting repeatedly, I felt slighted. Rather, Bill, you talked over me in the meeting repeatedly. Well, there's no conversations. The fact that you have feelings about it is why you're even go. So when we ignore the true root cause, we miss solving anything. And our feelings matter. There's this, and I don't know if it was with the corporatization or who knows what fully drove it. It's very complex, but the idea that we're just another brick in the wall, right? A cog in the machine type thing. You become a better employee by subsuming all your humanity and, just being hitting the grindstone every day, right? That's not what goes on. And we got to stop deceiving ourselves. We're flesh and blood. We have feelings. If we ignore them in these difficult conversations, we're actually not getting, because it's about the feelings, right?
You mean I can't just stuff down my feelings and drown them in alcohol and Netflix?
Well, you can, but nobody might want to live with you,
Right.
So,
not a good tactic.
Yeah, right. That might be a kick the can for a moment, but they're going to come to roost. And they get worse in the workplace when you don't address them. So when you don't express those feelings in the conversation, and this is one of those things that can help difficult conversations go well, is saying, I feel really upset right now. Or I was mad when when you don't get those things out of there, those feelings will cloud the conversation. So
yeah, and they can leak into the conversation and make you say things that then you actually didn't mean, right?
Yeah, you got it. And you can't really listen either because you're just thinking about these things. And lots of times your mind is racing like, how do I make it about what happened? But really it's about my feelings.
Right. And during these conversations, because of this emotional response, you can start to have physiological changes, right? So when the stress responses start kicking in, you may start feeling flushed. Your heart might start racing. You might start sweating. Like these are very common things that happen during these difficult conversations. And this starts to cloud your thinking. And one way to get through that is actually express some of your feelings, to talk about what you're feeling right in that moment, and this can make it easier to move forward and to listen as part of the conversation.
Yeah, and so when you don't, it kind of takes a toll on your self-esteem, and it takes a toll on the relationship. Before I knew all this stuff, and heck, a couple times I just screwed up a difficult conversation, even after knowing this stuff, is when I just focus on the facts and, maybe I was so flooded, I couldn't say anything. For me to recover from the difficult conversation gone bad took way longer because I didn't express, I feel really upset by this or, those kinds of things. But that being said, don't vent.
Right.
This is not a time to emotionally puke all over the person.
Right. Yeah. Find somebody else to do that with. Right. Find your good friend to do that with, and then go have the conversation, and in a way where you're not venting, but you are being honest about your feelings. Right. So you want to frame those feelings back into whatever you're talking about and how they, may have contributed to what's going on in the conversation, and express those kind of the full spectrum of your feelings, because oftentimes our emotions are very complex. And you may feel conflicting things. It's like, I feel very proud to be a part of this organization. At the same time, I feel like I'm being taken for granted and used. Those feelings can happen at the same time, and that's what makes this really hard. And I think it's okay and even helpful to acknowledge and express that full spectrum of what's going on.
Right, and they're feelings. They just happen. Right. So don't judge yourself for having those conflicted feelings or even feelings that don't fully make sense. But expressing them out using the I feel message is great. But what you don't want to do is get into blaming the person. You made me feel angry. Those emotions just happen. Like nobody forces you to have anything. We just have these responses as part of who we are and how we were raised and a whole host of complex issues.
Yeah, right. So don't get into the blame game when you're talking about your feelings and so forth. And sometimes once you kind of get these feelings out there and explore them a little bit, sometimes the difficulty starts to resolve itself, because this is, as you already mentioned, generally at the heart of difficult conversations, these feelings.
Yeah, and sometimes when you get the feelings out, that was all that mattered. Mm-hmm. I think in the book they had the example of a bride and a dad. She wanted a certain type of wedding, and he wanted to get something cheaper, but really the dad was having a hard time letting his daughter go.
Yeah.
Right. And so it wasn't even about getting the cheaper thing or fighting over the details of the dates. It was really just about, hey, as a father, I don't know how to let you go, and it really feels bad for me.
Mm-hmm.
And and then they were able to move forward. And there's lots of times, anybody that's been in a relationship or existed, sometimes just airing out the feelings makes it all better.
Right.
Not all the time. That'd be too easy, right?
That's right. So we've talked about the what happened conversation, the feelings conversation. The last one, and this one is pretty deep. This is the identity conversation. And it has these kind of three big questions that are embedded in that conversation. So what are those?
So you've got this. Well, the three questions are: am I competent? Am I a good person? And am I worthy of love? And those are challenging. And if you're listening, you're probably like, oof, man, that cuts to the core. And this is why I like that these are the three main questions about identity, because it cuts straight to the chase of our humanity. Mm-hmm. We want to have these things. And this is also why, as if you're a leader or individual contributor, anybody within an organization or navigate, if you're anybody but a trust fund baby that has to interact with people, you've got to sort these things out. The more solid you can be with yourself, and this is why I totally recommend therapy for executives and people that we coach, is if you haven't really sorted these out for yourself, you're probably going to have more difficult conversations, because more things will threaten your identity. So, am I competent? Everybody wants to know that they're good at something.
Mm-hmm. So, take the example of trying to do some sort of, performance feedback with, your direct report, with, a coworker, maybe even with your boss, trying to talk about performance or what someone's doing. These conversations are difficult because of this identity component. Because at the heart of it one piece of this is that you're questioning and you're raising this idea, am I competent? Do I deserve this job? Am I a good worker? Am I a good leader, a good manager, whatever it is? And, that's really, it can be very challenging. And, sometimes when we're having these difficult conversations, this is really in the background that is causing us to dig in our heels and to really kind of make it even worse than it should be.
Right. And then there's questions of self, like, am I a good person? And, a lot of people don't spend a lot of purposeful time thinking about their own moral constructs, how they think about things. Even people that come from a faith background often just assume the one that's modeled around them and they don't give it a whole lot of personal scrutiny. So it becomes easy for somebody to come in that maybe can mess with that person's sense of self. Mm-hmm. And then you start questioning, like, wait a minute, am I good? And, gaslighting is something that goes on. And the final one is, am I worthy of love? And this is such a sense of self kind of thing that it's, like, what if I just gave my whole sense of self over to you, Ben? Am I worthy of love? And depending on how we're working that day, I'm either having a great day or a horrible day. It doesn't, as an executive, as a manager, as a person navigating life, if you don't have that solid sense of self or a kind of innate, your operating rhythm under the hood of your brain is, I am a worthy person. I am a good person. I'm proud of how I'm living my life. I am competent. Then other people and situations that you can't read, like we talk about disentangling intent, something happens. You're like, oh, that person thinks I'm a horrible person.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that person may not have thought anything, but now your entire sense of self is crashing on itself because you haven't sorted out those identity issues. So, like, identity is a complex thing, and it's subject to these things that we call cognitive distortions. Ben, what's a cognitive distortion?
So this is any time when we're misrepresenting the information that we're being presented with, or when we are kind of changing our perception of reality in a way that's not representative of what's actually happening. And so with regard to identity, a common one is when we have this kind of all or nothing thinking. If I think I am a good leader, like that's a really big part of my identity, then it's going to be very challenging for me to hear and accept any kind of feedback that I may have messed something up.
Yeah, or you get a bad performance review, and all of a sudden you're like, I am absolutely worthless.
Right.
I don't deserve to exist. That's not true. So, like, even if you get fired from your daggone job, right? And, the psychology, we should do an episode on getting fired, but the psychology is lots of times people will get to that I am worthless. I am horrible. I'm not a provider. I'm not, on and on and on and on and on. Well, it's not true. I mean, you just cannot. There's probably only one person that is the worst person in the world by any objective measures. And it's, 99.999% likely you're not that person.
That's right.
So you got to get real. So if you, and the other distortion, you say, oh, well, I'm a good manager. Well, dude, you're probably not the best, right?
Yeah.
Right.
None of us are.
Yeah, we're complex people. We got our pluses and minuses. People that talk about sports, it's like, well, Randy really has a good passing game, but their defense isn't. So, that we got to start seeing ourselves as the complex beings that we are and accept that and drive on, right?
Yeah, yeah. And when I look back at, all the different leadership situations that I've been in over the past, 20 years or so, I really see how I have developed a much more complex and healthy view of my own identity. And what I mean by that is, I used to be, so I still am somewhat of a perfectionist. I like to do things really well and so forth. But I've realized how, that is a really limiting way. If I view myself as I do things perfectly, gosh, then I really get messed up when I would screw something up. And now it's like, hey, you know what? I do some things really, really, really well. I'm pretty aware of those things. And there's some things that I screw up, on a semi-regular basis. And I'm not so worried about those things because I have people around me who can help me with that kind of stuff. Or, not being as upset when something goes wrong. And it actually is a real source of strength because then, you're confident in those things that you can do well, and you're not as worried or as threatened by stuff that goes on in your environment that maybe otherwise would have threatened your identity.
Right. And it's super important to ground your identity. So, be differentiated from the people around you. Do not be emotionally infected by the stuff that they throw on you. And you do that by knowing who you are. And then also, everybody will always have some identity issues. We have a troop drive. We can't live in isolation. So we do calibrate ourselves to an extent from the people around us. So the only way to stabilize yourself individually, so you're less likely to be infected and derailed by some of these identity issues and conversations that threaten your identity, like, hey, let's talk about your management style. It's not working out. Oh gosh. If you're not grounded in yourself and proud of what you're doing, if you're not change those things so you can be proud about yourself, right? But you got to know what your identity issues are so you can be prepared. So when you're going into a difficult conversation where they're going to maybe talk about your performance as a manager or a leader, you have to be like, okay, well, I'm not the best in the world, so let's put that learning hat on, right?
Right.
But if you don't know that you have an identity issue around, I really desire to be perceived as a good manager or something, that not knowing those going into the conversation, you're more likely to be derailed.
Yes, that's very true. And I think there's some core things that the book mentions that you need to really recognize about yourself. And the first one is you're going to make mistakes. Just in life, you're going to screw things up. You're going to screw things up when you have these difficult conversations,
Oh, yeah.
right in the middle of them. And, one of the best things or a good tactic, if you realize that you're doing it, is saying, okay, I just messed up what I wanted to say. Can we re-engage? I really want to stay in this conversation and get back to what I really mean here because I messed up what I just said. That's very important. And the other one is, your intentions are actually very complex.
Yeah.
I mean, I think of this example, with children, when you're raising kids, and let's say, you're getting ready to go somewhere, and your kids are wearing something goofy, and you really wanted them to wear matching outfit or whatever.
Don't do that to your kids, Ben.
No, we generally don't. But the funny thing about your intentions is you can trick yourself. You can say, I want them to, be presentable or whatever. And really, maybe your intention is actually you want other people to see you and your family as being perfect. I mean, that actually could be a big part of your intention there. And these things are kind of all over the place. We are very good at tricking ourselves and making ourselves feel like our intentions are always pure and, really well-intentioned, but that's not necessarily always the case.
It's never the case, right?
Yeah.
Especially, and I see this in people that are highly motivated that really want to climb the corporate ladder.
Mm-hmm.
They'll come in and play dirty sometimes, with politics, or sometimes you just want to win. Like if you're one of those Strava people that, you want to run or get the Strava record for that bike, lane or race or whatever, some people, it's just a part of their psyche is being competitive and stuff like that. Right. So just understand that you may yes, I want to be a part of this organization, and I also want to stab Gary in the back politically.
Right.
You can have these, you kind of have to make peace with some of those bad features that might be part of who you are. There's almost this assumption that there's a bunch of Mother Teresas walking around, the corporate world, and anybody that has, any awareness at all knows that that's not what the jungle of this work life thing is, right?
Far from it.
and you're part of the problem,
Right.
Or, they're just you're in a work environment with a complete monster who's horrible and has conflicting intentions, conflicting emotions. And then there's the people you work with, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you got to make peace with that if you're going to do these conversations well. And
that's right.
And that brings us to the other core thing, which is you've contributed to the problem generally.
Right. For example, you got that poor performing employee, okay, be honest. Have you really set expectations well with that person? Have you really, helped that person understand what their job is and what success looks like?
Right.
And if the answer is maybe or not really, well, guess what? You also contributed to the problem. How long have you gone noticing that something was going on wrong and not mentioned anything? Oh.
Oh, man. And I've seen this in the Army and out in the corporate world where somebody comes in and maybe the guy didn't do anything. And, the sentiment's well, be more lucky next time.
Right.
If you're that person saying that kind of stuff, well, I can't point to something's wrong, but you just need to have better luck. You're also part of the problem too, right?
Mm-hmm. Now, in these difficult conversations, you might need to raise these identity issues specifically, So, you may even need to say, what I'm hearing you say is, or what I'm interpreting here is that you don't think I'm doing a good job. You don't think I'm, a good employee. Is that right? And those types of things.
Right. And even be more specific about the identity.
Yeah.
Like, do you think I'm a bad employee?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's the what happened, did I do a bad job here? Right. And there's the feelings, I felt really mad when you told me you needed to talk to me about subpar performance. And then the identity thing is, hey, what I hear you saying is I'm not a worthwhile employee or a person or a dad or a boss. Is that right? That's cutting to the chase of saying, when you do these things, when you act in this toxic way or whatever, it makes me feel like I don't even belong on this planet. Bring it to that identity piece.
Right. Another good example that I think is fantastic here is, specifically mentioning, I'm sensitive to criticism of my work, but I also realize I need feedback. Can we be aware of that as we talk about it? That's recognizing this dual competing type of identity issue that's going on. It's like I'm very sensitive to getting criticism. I also realize I need feedback. It's not an either or. It's a both and situation. And throwing it out there and saying, can we be aware of that dynamic as we talk about my performance?
Right. Yeah. And if you've got these struggles with identity, again, professional help with a mental health professional can be really awesome.
Mm-hmm.
You got to take care of yourself. If identity issues and like emotional regulation, some of these are regularly influence your work. It's, if you got a cavity in your tooth, you're going to get it filled, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you've got a cavity in your emotional and personal life, you need to take care of yourself. Life isn't fair. We weren't all raised by, parenting PhD experts that actually live what they research, right? So most of us didn't come from that place, but we can take responsibility of our own lives and sort those issues, and it'll help you have these difficult conversations and navigate them.
Right. And it'll help you maintain some of that balance as you're having the conversation. If you walk into there with some of your identity issues sorted out, or at least some awareness of them, it'll help you, have less of a probability of getting knocked off balance and getting derailed during the conversation.
Right. Because even if you have all this stuff locked down tight and you've done really well, you're still subjected to those normal forces of the difficult conversation, which is that, what happened, the feelings and identity stuff, right?
That's right. Yeah, so those are the three conversations that are happening in any difficult conversation, and they're kind of happening at the same time. The what happened, the feelings, and then the identity conversation. So I think that we can kind of move now to talking a little bit about how you can prepare for and even conduct these difficult conversations.
Right. So, there's pretty much 5 steps to it, Ben. So what's the first one?
So the first one is prepare by walking through the 3 conversations that we just talked about. And maybe we can talk about all 5 and then we can explore them a little bit more. So that's number 1. Number 2 is check your purposes, right? Really try to be honest with yourself and decide whether or not this is something you want to raise. Number 3 is start from what's called the third story, and we'll explain what that means in a few moments. Number 4 is exploring their story and yours. And then number 5 is moving on to problem solving. So, number 1, we already talked about preparing, walking through those 3 conversations and checking your purposes. Number 2, deciding whether to raise it. So let's talk a little bit about this third story thing. This is step number 3. So start from the third story. This is the idea of what an unbiased observer, to the best of your ability, would have said about the situation. So what's this all about?
Yeah, I want to real quick go back to, so when you prepare by walking through the 3 conversations, don't just look at it. Pull out a piece of paper, and this is where you can be really deliberate and talk about what happened. Maybe write a little summary. Feelings, like explore those things, go through a checklist. identity. What identity issues does this bring up for me? Write, and then write the answers to those things.
That's good.
And then check in your purpose. What do you want to accomplish? Right. And those kinds of things. So you can kind of have that, that's a purposeful preparation rather than just being like, oh yeah, what happened, feelings, identity, you got to be really intentional with that.
Right. And what that'll help you, I'm glad you brought that up, because what that'll help you do is during the difficult conversation, your mind might, just given how we are, your mind might start racing in many different directions. You might start feeling very emotional and get emotionally flooded and not be able to think really very clearly. And by having some of that written down, you can come back to it, and it'll help you kind of regain your footing.
Right. All right. So starting from the third story, or unbiased observer, or some people have called this, imagine you're in a helicopter looking down at what's happening, right? Mm-hmm. So this is trying to come out of your mind, trying to kind of put on shelf the identity and feelings part, and trying to look from the perspective of somebody that doesn't have all that baggage that we just bring to interactions.
Mm-hmm. Right. So you're talking about, starting to describe the situation in a way that, you're talking about observable things and behaviors that aren't just, from your own perspective. So you'd be talking kind of about a more holistic picture, as you mentioned, of what happened. And the important thing is, it's very natural for us to want to start kind of within our own story and just, oftentimes the difficult conversation is, I'm going to just talk about what happened and I'm going to talk about it from my perspective. That is not a good idea. Why would that not be a good idea?
Right, because you're just in your own head at that point.
That's
and
right.
The person's going to be like, whoa, it feels like almost an assault, right?
It does, yes.
And so that's going to make them defensive right away, and that's not a good way to open. So you really got to start thinking like a mediator, put on your mediator hat. If you were going to come, and that's going to change your posture. And, when you start just, exploring each other's stories, being able to describe the difference in the stories. So Ben, when that happened, you were thinking this. However, because I only saw these things happening, I was thinking that, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. That can be very helpful. So you're starting from that third story. You're talking about those differences between the different stories. Now, this doesn't mean that you should just give up on your own perspective, right? So you start with the third story, but you will get to a point where you're going to explore your perspective. Now, if they start the conversation, and often, sometimes the difficult conversation is not something that you initiate, then you can. Oftentimes, they will start launching into it by talking about their story. You can acknowledge what they said, but then you can pull back, and then you can kind of reframe it and say, well, can we talk about it kind of from a different perspective? And then try to interject that third story into the conversation.
Right. So this is a prime example of you knowing the tools and the flow of difficult conversation and the three conversations that happen. You can use that to shape their approach. Okay, so this is what you're saying. Hey, let's explore my story now. You can have some of these key phrases that can start to flip the conversation in a more productive way.
That's right. So that's step number 3, starting from that third story, the unbiased observer. So you've prepared by walking through the three conversations. Number 1. Number 2, you've checked your purposes, decided whether or not to raise it. Number 3, you've started from that third story and tried to provide an unbiased account to the best of your ability about what's going on. Number 4 is then moving from the third story and going towards exploring their story and your story.
Right. So this is kind of where you make a bid for them. Like, hey, this is my purpose here, right? I want to invite you to be a partner with me as we explore these things. Now, it doesn't have to be as trite as that, but that's kind of, getting, hey, I'm having this conversation that's challenging because, like, that's a good way to lead out with your intention. And then, pulling around like, hey, would you partner with me in like working through this? This can't be pleasant for either of us, but let's do it. Right.
Right. One time I heard someone talking about, giving difficult performance feedback, and he really put it nicely. And he said, these conversations are hard, and part of the challenge is, don't give up on it too early. Like, if it's going badly, like, as long as it's not completely derailing, stay in the conversation and say, look, I really want us to get to a better place here. Can we continue this conversation? We may say things we don't mean. Let's figure this out. And that may happen. And it's very important during this time of sharing stories. And, so you've already shared the third story. You've already kind of explored theirs and yours, to really actively listen to the other person, and this is something you've got to be intentional about, because it is oftentimes our reaction and our instinct to be thinking about what we want to say next. When someone's talking, it's like, I'm thinking about what I want to say instead of truly hearing them.
Right. This isn't about making speeches and being eloquent, right?
No.
You gotta be curious. You got to be aware of your thoughts. You need to acknowledge those feelings. I mean, this takes some personal skill in juggling these balls while you're going through this stuff. You got to ask some good questions. Paraphrasing's good. Hey, so what I'm hearing you say is, that's super important. But you don't give up on yourself just going through. Don't go into therapist mode where you're going to let them get out all their emotions, feelings, perspectives, and you just say, right? You have a right to speak. You need to make sure the goal isn't to be a therapist for them, but to make sure that you both get your stories, your feelings, your identity issues out there, so you can both kind of look at the chessboard, see where things lie, and make an informed decision.
Right. And, one thing that you can do is start with those things that really matter most to you, and don't make them guess about it. Right. So you say, look, I want to have this conversation because let's take the example of the poor performing employee, because I think you are, you have great potential here. I really want to make this work. We hired you for a reason, and I want to have a conversation about how we can make that better. Right. And, that helps set the tone for where you're headed with the conversation. It starts to speak to some of those other things, those other issues of identity and feelings as well.
Right.
And so if you're, then going into the mode of telling your story, a couple things you want to really be careful about. You want to present your story, but don't present your conclusions as the truth. That's not going to be helpful, because that's not, continuing to extend that invitation to explore and map the contribution that you both probably had to the situation. You can also share kind of where your conclusions come from. This is why I'm feeling this way. And it can be hard in the moment, but try to avoid and don't exaggerate using words like always and never. That's just,
more black and white. All or nothing thinking. It's a total distortion.
That's right. And it just really can inflame the situation and make it worse. And kind of going back to that active listening and paraphrasing type of stuff, you can ask them to paraphrase stuff back to you. Say, okay, now I've shared what I see. Can you tell me how you see what I just said, right? And then ask, how do you see it differently, and why do you see it differently? And this is all about exploring those different stories, those different contributions.
Right. So, this is a great time to make sure that, people say, when you did this meant. You got to be careful of those, like, intentions versus impact, right? Mm-hmm. You got to make sure that you, and even introducing that vocabulary in the conversation, like, hey, we can't know people's intentions, but we can talk about the impact of what happened.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And if you find the conversation is running off course, it's, the person is kind of taking a different direction, reframe it and just keep doing that. Say, okay, today's conversation is about this, right? This is what I want to talk about. We could talk about that other thing another time. This is what we want to talk about today. So reframe it. That'll keep you on track. Always be trying to take the time to listen, be persistent about the conversation, And, if there is some sort of specific issue, you got to name the dynamic, right? You can do what the folks in counseling psychology call a process comment. It's like, okay, I just want to pause right now, and what I see is, we're both starting to make accusations, and it feels like that's not going to be productive. Can we stop doing that? That can be a really helpful way to get things back on track.
Right. And it just interdicts, because lots of times people, they're scared of the difficult conversation, terrified. It finally happens. And so, it's, jumping off the high dive for the first time as a kid, right? For the pool, back in the day when they had high dives at pools, right? Yeah. Insurance is hard, but, you lots of times you don't see somebody just get up and walk on off it when they're terrified. They look at it, and then they have to force themselves to jump. Like maybe they even walk and they just run for it. So sometimes with difficult conversations, people just run for it. And your job as somebody that knows the secret sauce of difficult conversations is to slow that stuff down, and help get them on a meaningful way, because their inner psyche is also terrified of this conversation.
That's right. So after you've done, the step number 4, which is exploring their story and your story, then, and only then, can you really move on to problem solving. This is the time when you can start moving on, looking towards solutions, ways to peacefully coexist, to develop some sort of collaborative alliance with that person. And, keep in mind that it when you're coming up with different solutions and you're doing some problem solving, it takes 2 people to agree, right? So you need to also be on board with what's going on. Maybe you can even propose a test. Say, hey, can we try this and see how it goes to make things better? That's one thing that you can do.
Yeah, lots of times these difficult conversations go, all right, here's what's happened. Let's problem solve. And you miss all the guts. And that's why the things recur, right? Because you really didn't deal with the substantive, parts of it.
Right. Great. So those are some 5 steps to prepare for and conduct these difficult conversations. Want to recap of what we talked about today?
Yeah. So today we talked about what a difficult conversation is and when to have them or not have them. We talked about the 3 conversations, which is what happened, feelings, and identity. And then we talked about how to prepare and conduct these challenging conversations.
Thanks for listening to the Indigo Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider helping us by rating us on Apple Podcasts or wherever
that went
you
pretty
listen.
well.
Telling your friends about us,
really
having us on your podcast, or mentioning us on social media. Our website is www.indigopodcast.com, where you can access more information about us and this episode. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.